The snow had not yet stopped falling when Viscount Edward Ashbury returned to Ashbury Hall. The wheels of his carriage carved dark furrows through the white drifts, and the horses snorted clouds of steam into the frozen air. He stepped out before the front steps without waiting for a footman. A black coat clung to his tall frame, streaked with flakes that melted upon contact with the heat of his anger. Inside, candles burned low, and the house reeked faintly of lilies, the scent of morning. He crossed the marble floor in long strides, the echo of his boots breaking the silence that had swallowed the house for days. A door opened at the end of the corridor, and a woman appeared, still dressed in black. Lady Amelia stood very still, her hands clasped before her, her face pale against the dark veil that fell to her shoulders. Edward stopped only a few feet away from her, his jaw clenched as if the act of looking at her required strength. "You should have left before I arrived," he said quietly. "I will not have my brother's widow haunting this house." Amelia's voice was soft, nearly swallowed by the stillness. "This was his home. It is mine no longer. I was gathering what little is mine when I heard your carriage." His gaze was cold, but the faint tremor in his voice betrayed the storm beneath. "Then gather faster." She did not move. The ticking of the clock on the mantel filled the silence between them. The air seemed to thicken with unsaid words. Edward's hand brushed the hilt of his gloves. "My brother loved you beyond reason. You broke him." Amelia's lashes lowered. "He was already broken before I came into his life, my lord." Edward turned sharply away, unwilling to listen, unwilling to see. Outside, the wind rose and rattled the windows. That was the moment everything began to unravel, though neither of them yet understood it. 3 weeks earlier, the house had been filled with guests and grief. The funeral had drawn nearly every family of consequence from the county. Men bowed their heads, women dabbed their eyes, and the vicar spoke of sacrifice, of illness, of the brief life of Lord Henry Ashbury, who had died in his 33rd year. Lady Amelia stood beside the casket, her hands folded in black gloves, her face expressionless. Behind her veil, her eyes were swollen from sleeplessness, not tears. She had shed enough of those in the long weeks before Henry's final breath. When the ceremony ended and the mourners drifted away, she lingered by the grave until the last spadeful of earth fell. The only sound was the caw of distant crows and the creak of bare branches in the wind. Inside the manor, whispers began almost at once. Henry's illness had been long, but the servants recalled his laughter before marriage, and the gossip in the village painted Amelia as the quiet, distant wife who had sapped the joy from him. She did not defend herself. There was nothing she could say that would silence people determined to believe a story that pleased them. When Edward received the letter summoning him home from the continent, it arrived stained by rain and the fingerprints of many messengers. He read it once, crumpled it, and boarded the first ship that would take him across the channel. The war had hardened him. He had seen too many men die for causes they barely understood, but the thought of his brother dying under the same roof as the woman he had married out of affection filled him with a bitterness he did not name. The carriage reached the manor at dusk. He entered the hall to find his father seated in the study, his mother weeping quietly by the window. The scent of port and despair hung in the air. "The title is yours now," his father said, voice brittle. "And so is the estate." Edward bowed his head slightly. "And her?" His father hesitated. "There are matters of inheritance, delicate matters. The estate cannot be divided. It would cause scandal if she was sent away unprotected. The lawyers advise marriage." Edward stared at him in disbelief. "Marriage? To my brother's widow?" "An arrangement only in name. It will preserve what your brother built and spare us the wagging of tongues." He laughed, a dry sound. "And if I refuse?" His father's gaze hardened. "Then the debts will swallow us. Henry was not the steward you are. The lands are entailed. The name depends upon this." Edward said nothing. His mother reached for him, her eyes red-rimmed. "Do what must be done, Edward, for the family." Quote. Later that night, when the snow began to fall and the candles burned low, he found himself standing outside the door of the small parlor where Amelia sat alone. The faint glow of the fire lit her profile. She did not look up when he entered. "They wish us to marry," he said. She nodded once. "I know. I do not love you," he said, the words more declaration than cruelty. "I never asked for your love," she replied. For a long moment, they sat in silence, two strangers bound by grief and duty. Outside, the wind howled across the moors, carrying the first promise of the winter to come. When Edward left the room, he told himself it was necessity, not fate, that had chained their lives together. Yet even then, something unsettled him, the calm in her eyes, the absence of protest, the quiet acceptance of her own unhappiness. The snow continued through the night, erasing footprints, softening edges, and covering the fresh grave on the hill until it seemed as though nothing had ever disturbed the earth at all. By morning, the engagement had been announced. At the edge of the frozen garden, Amelia stood looking toward the horizon, her veil fluttering in the wind. The world lay silent and white before her, vast and empty as her heart. She whispered a single sentence to the cold air. "Let this be my penance." Quote. Behind her, unseen, Edward watched from the terrace. The words reached him, though barely audible. He did not yet know why they struck him harder than any accusation. As the sun rose over Ashbury Hall, two lives, both scarred by loss, began a reluctant entanglement that neither duty nor pride could untangle. The bells of Street Matthew had rung only once that morning, when Lady Amelia arrived at Ashbury Hall as Viscountess Ashbury. The snow had turned to rain, thin and cold, streaking the carriage windows with ribbons of grey. No music marked her arrival, no guests waited to receive her. The marriage had taken place quietly, witnessed by a vicar, two servants, and Edward himself, who had recited the vows with a voice calm enough to sound almost detached. When the carriage stopped before the steps, he offered his hand only because it was expected of him. Amelia took it without looking up, the touch brief and chill as winter air. Inside, the hall felt hollow. The servants, uncertain whether to curtsy or avert their eyes, stood in two rows and murmured greetings that faded into silence as the couple passed. Amelia's black gloves brushed against her skirts. She felt the weight of a house that did not want her, filled with portraits that watched in judgment from dark walls. Her new chambers had once belonged to Edward's mother, a woman remembered for her beauty and sternness. The furniture stood polished and still, the curtains heavy with dust. Amelia dismissed her maid early and unpacked her few belongings herself. A locket, a small book of psalms, a folded handkerchief embroidered with Henry's initials. She set them carefully in the drawer and closed it as though sealing away a chapter of her life. Downstairs, Edward spoke briefly with the butler before retreating to his study. The door closed, and the click of the latch echoed through the corridors. Amelia sat at the edge of her bed, listening to the sound of distant footsteps fade until the house fell quiet. She had expected little, yet the emptiness of that silence still hurt. Days slipped by with the same dull rhythm. Breakfast was served in the east dining room at 9. Edward rarely appeared. When he did, he spoke of estate matters in short sentences and left before she finished her tea. The rest of the day stretched before her like an unending corridor. She walked through rooms lined with cold marble and colder memories. The portrait of Lord Henry hung in the library. His eyes, painted in oils, seemed almost alive beneath the dust of months. She stood before it one afternoon, the hem of her gown brushing the carpet. The artist had caught the warmth in his smile, the curve of his hand resting upon a book of poems he had loved. For a moment, the image blurred, and she had to turn away. She began to spend her evenings at the pianoforte in the small drawing-room. The instrument was slightly out of tune, its keys yellowed, but the act of playing steadied her thoughts. The music was never loud. It drifted softly through the halls like a prayer not meant to be heard. Edward passed once, paused in the doorway, and continued without a word. The servants, once wary, grew curious. Mrs. Wilkins, the housekeeper, remarked to the cook that the new Viscountess was a quiet sort, not one for airs. The younger maids found reasons to linger when Amelia crossed the hall, for she greeted them by name and asked after their families. Such kindness had not been common in that house since the death of Edward's mother. One afternoon, while arranging flowers in the sitting-room, Amelia heard the thunder of hooves. She looked out and saw Edward returning from the village, his coat dark with rain. He dismounted, handed the reins to a groom, and strode toward the entrance. When he entered, his expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on some private calculation. "Did the tenants speak well of the new arrangement?" she asked quietly. He seemed almost surprised she had spoken. "They will manage," he said, removing his gloves. "I reduced the rents for those affected by the storm." "That was kind of you," she said. "Prudent," he corrected, hanging his hat. Empty barns yield nothing. Her smile faded, but she nodded. "Of course, my lord." That evening, she took her supper alone. A note from Edward lay beside her plate. "I will dine in the study. Business requires my attention." She folded the paper and placed it aside without comment. The candles flickered, throwing long shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind rose again, shaking the panes like an impatient hand. Later, as she prepared for bed, she heard faint music drifting from the lower floors, a violin, hesitant, searching for melody. She descended the stairs in her dressing gown and followed the sound to the study door. It was half open. Edward stood by the hearth, bow in hand, eyes closed as he played. The tune faltered, uncertain, but in its broken rhythm she heard longing. He stopped when he noticed her. "Forgive me," he said, setting the instrument down. "I did not intend to disturb you." "You did not," she said softly. "It was beautiful." He hesitated, as if unused to praise. "I learned when I was a boy. It helps me think." "Then you should play more often." Her words hung between them, simple and sincere. He inclined his head slightly, then turned back to the fire. She lingered for a heartbeat longer before retreating up the stairs. The sound of the bow did not resume. In her chamber, she sat by the window and watched the last snowflakes dissolve into rain. She wondered whether two people could inhabit the same house and yet remain as distant as stars. Her life had become a series of quiet gestures and unanswered silences, but beneath that stillness, something fragile had begun to stir a faint curiosity about the man who hid behind his grief and his ledgers. When she blew out the candle, the darkness seemed less empty than before. The next morning brought a letter from Edward's solicitor, reminding him of debts left unresolved from his brother's affairs. Amelia overheard his raised voice in the corridor and recognized the tone of frustration that often hides fear. She wanted to speak, to offer comfort or counsel, but the door between them stayed closed. So she turned once more to the pianoforte, her fingers tracing notes that filled the house with sound. For the first time she sensed someone listening at the far end of the hall. When she finished, the silence that followed felt warmer than the one before. The rain had eased by evening, leaving behind the faint scent of damp earth. The lamps in the dining room cast a soft glow across the long mahogany table, polished until it mirrored the flicker of the flames. Lady Amelia sat alone at one end, the silver untouched, the soup cooling before her. Edward was late again. She traced the rim of her glass with one gloved finger and listened to the steady tick of the clock above the mantel. When he finally entered, he looked weary. His cravat hung loose, and there was a smudge of ink on his sleeve. He murmured a brief apology to the butler, who retreated with the quiet efficiency of one long accustomed to silence. Edward sat across from her and reached for the decanter. The amber liquid caught the light as he poured, the gesture precise, controlled. "You should not wait for me," he said without looking up. "I told them to serve you earlier." Amelia set down her spoon. "It is no great trouble to wait. Coup-pee. Unnecessary nonetheless." The pause that followed stretched thin. The only sound was the rain sliding from the eaves outside. She studied him in the candlelight, the tired eyes, the firm line of his mouth. There was something restless beneath his composure, like a tide pressing against its own restraint. "The tenants speak well of you," she said at last. "Mrs. Wilkins mentioned you arranged to repair the bridge after the flood." He shrugged slightly. "A bridge left broken serves no one. Coaz, I think they see more than practicality in your actions." His gaze flicked toward her then, sharp and distant. "Do they? I imagine they also see a man who married his brother's widow. Hardly a figure of sympathy." The words struck harder than he intended. Amelia's breath caught, but she steadied it before replying. "They see what gossip tells them. It is easier to repeat scandal than to search for truth." Edward's fingers tightened around his glass. "Truth," he repeated quietly. "You speak as though you possess it." "I only know what I lived," she said. "And you, my lord, know only what you were told." The remark hung in the air like a challenge. He met her eyes fully for the first time in days, and in that brief clash of silence, something unseen shifted between them, anger, curiosity, perhaps both. "I was told my brother adored you," he said, his voice low, "that he wrote poems about your smile, that he spoke of nothing else until his dying day." Kujavku's Amelia's hands folded in her lap. "He was kind to me, but kindness and love are not the same." Edward's jaw hardened. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect nothing from you," she replied, "least of all belief." The candles wavered as a draught moved through the room. She looked away first, her gaze settling on the rain-streaked window. "I cared for your brother as one might care for a friend or a patient. He was ill long before I came to him. I nursed him because it was right, not because I wished to gain his name." Edward rose abruptly, pushing his chair back with a scrape. "Enough. I will not listen to you tarnish his memory." "I would never tarnish it," she said softly. "I lived beside his suffering. I saw how he tried to spare everyone else from it." He stopped at the threshold, his hand on the doorframe. The fire crackled behind them, the only witness to the words that trembled between truth and pride. He did not turn back, but his voice came quieter now, weighted with weariness. My brother died loving a woman who never loved him back. Amelia stood slowly, her eyes following him though he did not meet them. And you never knew what your brother asked of me, she said, her tone steady, almost tender. Edward hesitated as if those words had struck something unguarded, but he left without another glance, and the echo of his footsteps faded down the corridor. Amelia sank back into her chair. The servants returned to clear the untouched dishes, their movements cautious, silent. She heard the faint murmur of voices from the hall and the closing of the study door. The house seemed to exhale, returning to its usual stillness. Later, unable to sleep, she wandered to the library. The room smelled of old paper and smoke. Her fingers brushed the spines of the books as she moved through the rows, stopping before the desk where a single candle still burned. Papers lay scattered, ledgers open, and on one sheet she noticed a handwriting that was not Edward's curved, delicate, unmistakably Henry's. She hesitated before reading the first line. For my brother, when he returns. The words blurred in the wavering candlelight. The letter spoke of regret, of debts both financial and moral, of gratitude toward the woman who had shown him compassion when he no longer deserved it. If you meet her, treat her kindly. She has done more for me than I ever confessed. Amelia folded the paper and replaced it exactly where she had found it. The hour was late. As she turned to leave, she heard faint steps beyond the doorway. Edward stood there, half in shadow, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I could not sleep," she answered. "I did not mean to intrude." His eyes dropped to the desk. "Did you read it?" She hesitated. "A few lines." "Then you know what he thought of you." "Kota." "Yes," she said, "but I also know that memories can be kinder than truth." He looked as though he wanted to reply but could not find the words. The silence between them was no longer empty. It pulsed with things unsaid, with questions neither dared voice. He stepped aside to let her pass, and she brushed by him, the faint scent of lavender following her. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused and glanced back. He still stood in the doorway, the candlelight throwing half his face into shadow. For the first time she thought she saw not anger, but confusion, the first crack in a wall built of grief and pride. That night the wind returned, moaning across the moors. Amelia lay awake listening to it, wondering what part of a person grief could change and what part it merely revealed. She thought of Edward's voice, sharp and uncertain, and of the letter that had lain forgotten among his ledgers. The house felt less silent than before, as if the very walls had begun to breathe again. The first snow of the season arrived quietly during the night, laying a pale veil over the gardens. At dawn, the world outside Amelia's window seemed untouched and still, as though the earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. She rose early, drawn to the silence. The library door creaked when she opened it, and the faint smell of wax and dust lingered in the air. The room felt different in morning light. She walked toward the tall shelves that lined the far wall and began to trace the spines of books, as though each might whisper something of its former reader. Edward had always said little about his brother, but in this house, Henry's presence remained everywhere, in the portraits, in the small personal items that no one had dared remove. A loose sheet of paper caught her attention, where it protruded from a drawer of the old escritoire. She pulled it free and found a small bundle of letters tied with fading ribbon. The ink had browned with age, and Henry's handwriting looped gracefully across each page. Amelia hesitated before untying the ribbon. Her heart beat faster as she unfolded the first letter. "My dearest brother," it began, "you will one day return to this place and wonder what I have done with the fortune father entrusted to me. I wish I could tell you that I managed it wisely. The truth is far less flattering." She read on, her eyes moving slowly, absorbing every line. Henry confessed debts, reckless ventures, and shame. Yet between those confessions were other words, softer ones: gratitude for Amelia, who had entered his life when he was already sick and failing. He wrote that she had been more nurse than wife, more guardian than companion. She asked for nothing, Edward. Not love, not comfort, not even respect. Only peace. Her hand trembled as she turned to the second letter. The tone there was different, more desperate, as if written in fever. "I fear my time is shorter than the doctors admit. I have made arrangements so that she will not be destitute. Promise me, if she remains when I am gone, that you will see her safe." Amelia pressed the pages against her chest. The ache that had lingered since Henry's death returned not as grief, but as sorrow for what had been misunderstood. She had loved him, yes, but not in the way the world had assumed. She had loved him for his gentleness, his gratitude, his fragile spirit. There had never been passion, only pity and duty. The door opened suddenly behind her, She turned, startled. Edward stood in the doorway, still dressed for riding, his hair damp with melted snow. His eyes went at once to the letters in her hands. "What is that?" She stepped back instinctively. "They are your brothers. Where did you find them?" "In the desk. They were hidden among his papers." "Comding." He crossed the room in 2 strides, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "You had no right to search through my brother's belongings." "I was not searching," she said quietly. "I found them by chance." His hand came down hard upon the desk. "Do you expect me to believe that?" "I expect nothing," she said, holding the bundle close. "But you should read them, Edward. They may change what you think of him, and of me." His expression darkened. "You mean to clear your name with a few sentimental lines? My brother's handwriting will not absolve you of what you did." Her composure wavered, but she did not retreat. "And what exactly have I done, my lord?" "You turned his kindness into obligation. You let him waste away believing you cared." Amelia's voice broke despite her effort to keep it steady. "He was already dying when I met him. I cared because no one else would." Quote. He stared at her for a long moment, the fury in his eyes giving way to something colder. "You are clever," he said at last. "Clever enough to feign humility while playing the martyr. Keep your letters if they comfort you, but do not bring them to me again." He turned sharply and left the room, the door closing with a sound that seemed to echo through her chest. She sank into the nearest chair, the letters trembling in her hands. For several minutes she could do nothing but sit and listen to the silence that followed his departure. It was heavier than before, filled with the weight of words that had missed their mark. Later that day, she wrapped the letters in linen and hid them beneath the false bottom of the escritoire drawer. They were too precious to burn, too dangerous to keep in plain sight. She wondered whether Edward would ever look for them, or whether he preferred his anger unchallenged. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet isolation. The servants moved through their duties softly, aware of the tension that had thickened the air. Mrs. Wilkins brought Amelia a tray of tea, her kind eyes avoiding questions. "Thank you," Amelia murmured. "If I may, my lady," the older woman said gently. "His lordship carries a heavy heart. He is not himself." Amelia offered a faint smile. "He has every reason." When evening fell, she lit the fire herself. The crackle of the logs was the only sound. She took out her embroidery but found her hands too unsteady to sew. Instead, she sat gazing into the flames until her eyes blurred. In another part of the house, Edward paced the length of his study. He had poured himself a glass of brandy but left it untouched. The image of her face, pale and earnest, would not leave him. He told himself that she was a deceiver, that grief made her dangerous, but a single thought unsettled him. If she were lying, why had her eyes looked so full of pain? Near midnight he went to the window. The garden lay ghostly in the moonlight, the snow unbroken except for the faint trail of footsteps leading toward the chapel hill. For an instant he considered following, then dismissed the impulse. Whatever prayers she offered, they were not his to hear. Outside, Amelia knelt before Henry's grave, her cloak wrapped tight against the wind. The snow fell softly around her, muffling every sound. She pressed one gloved hand against the stone. "I tried to do what was right," she whispered. "I wish he could see that." When she rose, her steps faltered. The world tilted slightly, and a sudden dizziness swept through her. She steadied herself against the gate, breath shallow, heart pounding. The cold had seeped too deeply into her bones. By the time she reached the terrace, her strength was failing. She had almost reached the door when everything went black. Hours later, Edward was roused by frantic knocking. A servant stood in the corridor, breathless. "My lord, it is her ladyship. She has collapsed outside." He was gone before the man finished speaking, his bare feet silent on the stone. The sight that met him in the courtyard stopped his heart. Amelia lay motionless upon the steps, her cloak dusted white, her face colorless against the snow. He lifted her without thought, carrying her inside, shouting for blankets and the doctor. Her head rested against his shoulder, light as if she were made of air. For the first time since his brother's death, fear not anger gripped him. He did not leave her side until dawn. The doctor arrived before sunrise, his carriage wheels crunching over the frozen gravel. The lamps in the great hall burned low, their light trembling in the draught that slipped through the doors each time a servant passed. Edward stood beside the hearth, his coat thrown over a chair, his shirt open at the collar, his hair damp from melted snow. He had not slept. Amelia lay upon the settee in the drawing-room, wrapped in blankets, her breathing shallow but steady. Her cheeks were pale, the faint color of porcelain. The doctor bent over her, taking her pulse, murmuring something about exhaustion and exposure. Edward watched in silence, his hands clasped behind his back to disguise their trembling. "She will recover," the doctor said at last. "It is fortunate you found her when you did. Another hour in the cold, and it might have been otherwise." Edward inclined his head. "Thank you, doctor. Send the bill to my steward." When they were alone, he sank into the chair opposite her and let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The fire threw a wavering glow across her face. She looked fragile, almost unreal, as though one touch might dissolve her. He remembered the weight of her body in his arms, the cold that had seeped from her into him, and the terrifying stillness that had made him think, if only for a heartbeat, that she might already be gone. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Why were you out there?" he muttered, though she could not hear him. "What were you thinking?" Hours passed. The snow outside began to melt, dripping from the eaves in slow, rhythmic drops. When she stirred at last, the faintest sigh escaped her lips. Her lashes fluttered, and her eyes opened halfway, unfocused. "Edward," she whispered. He straightened at once, startled by the sound of his own name on her lips. "You must rest," he said softly. Her gaze moved to the window, then back to him. "The chapel. I went to—" "I know," he interrupted. "You should have told someone. You should have stayed inside." Her smile was faint, weary. "There are things one cannot pray for within walls." The words cut him in a way he did not expect. He looked away, staring into the fire. "You could have died," he said. "For what? To speak to a grave?" She closed her eyes again, too weak to answer. He sat beside her until dawn spread across the windows, the pale light softening the edges of the room. When her breathing deepened and steadied, he rose, his movements careful, almost reverent. By afternoon, Amelia's fever had subsided. She awoke to find herself in her own chamber, the curtains drawn back to let in winter light. A bowl of broth rested on the bedside table, and beside it lay a folded note in Edward's hand. "The doctor will return this evening. Do not leave your bed. E.A." She traced the initials with her fingertip, uncertain whether to smile or sigh. For the first time since their marriage, he had written to her directly, not through a servant. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, but there was something hurried in the strokes, as though he had been afraid his thoughts might vanish if he waited too long to set them down. When Mrs. Wilkins came to check on her, Amelia asked after him. "His lordship has not left the house," the woman replied. "He was in here half the night, and when I tried to send him to bed, he said he'd sleep in the chair outside your door." Amelia turned her face toward the window to hide the sudden rush of tears. "That was unnecessary." "Maybe," Mrs. Wilkins said with a small smile, but he would not be moved. As the day faded into twilight, Amelia heard the soft knock she had been waiting for. Edward entered quietly, his expression unreadable, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. "You should be resting," she said. "So should you." He moved closer to the bed, stopping a respectful distance away. "You frightened everyone last night." "I did not mean to." "I know." He paused, searching for words that refused to come easily. "The doctor says you will recover if you stay warm. I have had the fires lit in every room." "That is kind." "It is practical," he replied, but the tone lacked conviction. A faint smile touched her lips. "Then I thank you for your practicality." Cropped. He exhaled, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, the first trace of humor she had seen from him. "You are impossible to argue with, Lady Amelia. I have learned that arguments serve little purpose when both sides refuse to listen." His gaze softened. "Perhaps I have been guilty of that." The admission hung between them, quiet but real. She felt the warmth of it more than she understood it. He turned toward the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. "You should eat something. The broth will grow cold." "I will in a moment." When he faced her again, she noticed how the light from the flames caught in his eyes, turning grey to silver. For the first time, she did not see the man who had spoken to her with disdain, but someone uncertain, someone trying to unlearn his own cruelty. As he reached the door, she said, "Edward?" He stopped but did not turn fully. "Thank you." He nodded once and left, the door closing softly behind him. That night, when the house had fallen quiet, Amelia lay awake listening to the faint rhythm of footsteps pacing outside her door. She imagined him sitting there, head bowed, fingers tapping against the armrest as he wrestled with thoughts he did not yet have words for. In another life, perhaps, they might have met under kinder circumstances, without duty or suspicion, but life had offered them no such grace. Still, as the fire burned low and sleep claimed her, she allowed herself to believe that something small and precious had shifted, that the man who had once looked at her with contempt now saw her, even if only for a moment, with something close to care. When morning came, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. The frost sparkled on the trees, and the light crept across the floor of her chamber, like a quiet promise. Downstairs, Edward instructed the staff to bring fresh flowers to her room, a gesture that made the maids exchange curious glances. He ignored their whispers. He only said, "It is too cold without color." Then, as though embarrassed by his own words, he retreated to his study. Morning sunlight spilled across the room in a thin golden thread, glinting off the glass vases that now dotted the chamber. The scent of freshly cut flowers filled the air: roses, hyacinths, a handful of wild violets brought in from the glass house. Amelia stirred beneath the quilts, blinking against the light. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then she noticed the small card propped beside the vase nearest her pillow. They were all I could find that had any color. The handwriting was Edward's, firm but unsure, as if each word had been written with hesitation. Amelia touched the card lightly, then set it down with a soft smile she could not quite suppress. When Mrs. Wilkins entered with her breakfast tray, she stopped short and gave a small, knowing look. "The house has not smelled this pleasant in years, my lady." "They are lovely," Amelia said. "They are more than that," the older woman replied. "They are a sign that his lordship finally notices the season." Amelia pretended not to understand. "Perhaps he simply dislikes the chill of winter." "Come, perhaps," Mrs. Wilkins said, though her tone carried the quiet amusement of someone who saw more than she spoke. Later that morning, Edward came to see her. The knock at the door was hesitant, almost polite. She was sitting by the window, wrapped in a shawl, reading. When she looked up, he paused in the doorway as if uncertain whether to enter. "You look stronger today," he said. "I feel much improved." She gestured toward the vase. "Thank you for the flowers. They have brightened the room." He gave a small nod. "The doctor recommended fresh air. Would you care for a short walk in the conservatory later? Only if you are able." She hesitated, surprised by the offer. "I should like that very much." The conservatory was warm, almost humid compared to the frost outside. Sunlight filtered through the glass panels, striking the leaves with a soft shimmer. Amelia moved slowly along the path between rows of plants, her hand trailing across the fronds. Edward followed a step behind, attentive but silent. "It is strange," she said after a moment. "The world feels different when one has nearly lost it." He glanced at her. "You make it sound as though you died." "In a way, I think I did. When I collapsed in the snow, I remember nothing but quiet. It was not frightening, only still. Then I heard someone call my name and I returned." His jaw tightened. "That was me. I know." She smiled faintly. "I recognized the fear in your voice even before I opened my eyes." He looked away, embarrassed by the truth she had spoken. "I thought I was too late. But you were not." "No," he said softly. "I was not." The air between them thickened with something neither could name. He reached out, almost without thought, to steady her when she stumbled slightly on the uneven tiles. The warmth of his hand through her glove startled them both. She straightened, and he withdrew at once, murmuring an apology. "There is no need," she said, her cheeks tinged with color. "I would have fallen otherwise." They walked on in silence. The sound of dripping water from the roof was the only music. When they reached the far end of the conservatory, Amelia stopped to examine a small potted plant with fragile white blossoms. "What is this one called?" "Camellia," he said. "My mother loved them. She said they bloom when everything else has surrendered to the cold. Then they must be stubborn things. She used to say beauty often requires stubbornness." Amelia traced one pale petal with her fingertip. She was right. He watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "I do not think I ever thanked you for what you did that night." "You owe me no thanks." "I do," he insisted. "If I had not gone to look from my window, you might have—" He stopped, unable to finish. Amelia turned toward him. "You went looking for me?" "I saw the footprints," he admitted. "They led toward the chapel. I knew what you must have been doing." There was a pause. The sunlight shifted, falling across his face, softening its sharp lines. "Henry would have liked that you prayed for him," he said at last. "I did not pray for him," she replied gently. "I prayed for peace for both of us." He met her gaze, and something unreadable flickered in his expression. "You should rest now. The air grows cooler." As they made their way back through the hall, Amelia realized her heart was beating faster than it had in months. For the first time, their silence felt companionable rather than strained. Over the following days, the rhythm of the house changed subtly. Edward began taking his breakfast at the same table instead of in his study. The conversations were short, but no longer awkward. He asked after her health, her reading, her walks. Sometimes, when she laughed at one of his dry remarks, he looked almost startled, as if the sound were something new to him. One afternoon she found him in the library, surrounded by papers. "You spend so much time here," she said. "Do you ever read anything not bound in ledgers?" He looked up, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I used to. War reports cured me of poetry." "Then you must start again," she said. "Poetry restores what numbers take away." He regarded her thoughtfully. "You speak as though you know that from experience." "I do," she replied. "I spent years balancing duty and silence. Words saved me when people would not." He leaned back in his chair. "Perhaps you could lend me one of your books." She smiled. "Only if you promise not to mark the margins with calculations." The corner of his mouth curved upward. "I will do my best." From that day forward, a book would appear on his desk each week, always without note, and always chosen carefully. He never returned them with comment, yet each time she noticed the faintest fold in a page corner, his silent acknowledgement that he had read to the end. As January slipped toward February, the frost began to ease. The first snowdrops emerged along the path outside the conservatory, delicate and trembling in the cold breeze. Amelia ventured farther each day, and Edward always accompanied her, claiming concern for her health, though the truth was less simple. One afternoon, as they stood watching the sunset turn the fields to gold, she said quietly, "I think I am beginning to feel alive again." He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then, almost to himself, murmured, "So am I." The words hung in the air between them, fragile as breath. Neither spoke again until they reached the door. That night, as she closed her eyes, Amelia thought of the flowers, the soft light in the conservatory, and the warmth in Edward's eyes when he forgot to hide it. She fell asleep with a peace she had not known in years. Rain drummed steadily against the tall windows, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo the pulse of the house itself. The library, vast and shadowed, glowed with the warm light of a dozen candles. The air smelled faintly of parchment and smoke, the scent of long years and restless thought. Amelia sat curled in one of the deep armchairs near the fire, a book open upon her lap. Her shawl had slipped from her shoulders, and a loose strand of hair caught the flicker of the flames each time she turned a page. She had meant only to read for a few minutes, to pass the hours until the storm eased, but the stillness of the room had wrapped itself around her like a lullaby. Outside, thunder rolled distantly across the moors. Inside, she read aloud in a whisper, as though the words might keep her company. "Love seeketh not itself to please, nor for itself hath any care." Her voice faltered on the next line, for it seemed to echo strangely in the empty room. She looked up and froze. Edward stood a few paces away, his shoulder resting lightly against one of the bookcases. She had not heard him enter. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes, a gentleness she had never seen before. "Blake," he said quietly. "I had forgotten those lines." Amelia shut the book, suddenly self-conscious. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You did not." He came closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his steps. "I have spent enough evenings in this room to know how welcome a voice can be." She smiled faintly. "It seems we are both haunted by silence." "Ah." He studied her for a long moment, the corners of his mouth softening. "I think I have been haunted by many things, my lady." "Then perhaps it is time you let them rest," she said. "The dead should not hold the living captive." He moved toward the fire and gazed into it as though the flames might answer him. "You speak as if it were simple." "It is not simple," she said, "but it is necessary." "Coz." The rain pressed harder against the windows, and for a moment the sound filled the space between them. Edward turned and looked at her, truly looked, as though seeing not the woman he had married by obligation, but the person she had quietly become in his presence. "Tell me," he said after a pause, "what did you dream of before all this? Before my brother, before this house, before the weight of our shared misfortune?" The question startled her. "Dreams are a luxury. Few women are encouraged to keep." "Then humor me," he said softly. She set the book aside and folded her hands. "I once dreamed of traveling," she admitted, "of seeing the sea in places where it is blue rather than grey. I read of Italy, of its gardens and music. I thought perhaps one day I might go there. Then my father's debts destroyed that hope." He listened without interruption, his face intent. "You would have liked the sea," he said. "It is not kind, but it is honest." "And you?" she asked. "What did you dream of before duty found you?" He hesitated. "Of freedom, I suppose, the kind that does not ask a man to be what others expect. But war teaches you that freedom is only a word, and that peace is something rarer still. Amelia regarded him quietly. Perhaps peace begins where we choose to stop fighting ourselves. Could. He looked at her then, and in his eyes there was both surprise and gratitude, as though she had spoken a truth he had long tried to avoid. "Would you read to me?" he asked suddenly. "It has been years since anyone read aloud in this room." She hesitated only a moment before opening the book again. Her voice was soft but clear, filling the library with gentle rhythm. As she read, Edward settled into the chair opposite, his gaze fixed not on the pages but on her. The storm outside raged on. Yet within those walls there was calm, a fragile, unexpected calm neither of them dared disturb. When she reached the end of the poem, silence followed, thick and tender. Edward rose and walked toward the window. "I have not heard such words in a long time," he said. "I had forgotten they could sound so alive." "Words do not die," she replied. "We only stop listening." He turned back, and for the first time since she had known him, he smiled. It was not the polite, distant expression she had seen at dinners or in company, but something unguarded, almost boyish. It startled her so completely that she forgot to breathe for a heartbeat. "You should smile more often," she said before she could stop herself. "Why?" "Because it changes you," she said simply. He studied her with quiet amusement. "Then I fear I have been missing something essential." The fire cracked softly. The rain had begun to fade, its rhythm slowing to a whisper. Amelia rose, closing the book. "It is late," she said. "I should rest." He inclined his head. "Thank you for the reading." "Good night, my lord." "Good night, my lady." As she reached the door, he spoke again, his voice lower now. "Amelia?" She paused. "Would you leave the candle burning? I find the light comforting." She met his eyes over her shoulder. "As you wish." Crowd. When she left, the small flame remained, casting its glow across the shelves, the chairs, and the figure of a man who stood staring into the space where she had been. Outside, the rain eased into mist, and the scent of wet earth rose through the air like the memory of something once lost but not forgotten. That night, Edward did not return to his study. He remained in the library long after the fire had burned low, the words she had read still echoing softly in his mind. For the first time in many years, he felt the weight of his solitude lift, replaced by a quiet warmth he did not yet dare to name. And somewhere down the corridor, in her own room, Amelia dreamed of sunlight over blue water and of a voice that had finally learned how to listen. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper, embossed with the Petworth crest, the ink so dark it seemed almost to glisten. Amelia found it on the breakfast tray beside her cup of tea, the seal already broken. Edward had opened it earlier, as was his habit. His signature appeared neatly at the bottom of the acceptance note. "The Petworth ball," she murmured. "You mean to attend?" Edward folded the newspaper he had been reading. "It would be unwise not to. The Earl is a man of influence, and it has been noticed that we seldom appear in society together. People talk. They always will," she said quietly. "That may be true," he replied, "but I would prefer they not have reason to speak of neglect. The estate requires alliances. Appearances matter." She inclined her head, though a small tremor passed through her. The thought of returning to crowded rooms, of facing whispers and speculation, filled her with unease. "As you wish, my lord." That evening she went to the seamstress to have her gown adjusted. The color chosen was deep rose, a shade that brought warmth to her pale complexion. When she stood before the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. It had been so long since she had worn anything not black or grey. The woman in the reflection seemed almost to belong to another world, one of light and laughter she had long forgotten. When the night of the ball arrived, the carriage carried them through streets still slick with rain. The city shimmered beneath the gas lamps, and the sound of horses' hooves echoed against the cobblestones. Inside the carriage, silence stretched between them, broken only by the rhythmic sway of motion. Edward spoke at last. "You need not remain the entire evening. We will make an appearance, dance once, and depart. That will satisfy them." She nodded, grateful for his consideration. "I will follow your lead." At the entrance to the grand hall, chandeliers blazed with light, scattering reflections across the polished floor. The air smelled of perfume and wine and faintly of roses. Music floated from the orchestra at the far end, the lilting melody of a waltz. Heads turned as they entered. Murmurs followed, soft, quick, like the rustle of silk. Amelia felt them as one feels the brush of nettles against bare skin. She held her head high, her gloved hand resting lightly on Edward's arm. He guided her through the crowd with calm assurance, exchanging brief greetings with acquaintances. The stiffness in his posture did not escape her. This was duty, not pleasure. Yet when she faltered slightly, he glanced down and whispered, "Steady, you are doing well." Quote. The words, simple though they were, steadied her. They danced once, as he had promised. The movement was mechanical at first, but gradually, as the music carried them, Amelia began to relax. Edward's hand at her back was firm, his gaze steady upon hers. Around them, the ballroom spun in colors of gold and ivory, but for a few moments it felt as though they were alone in it. When the dance ended, he excused himself to speak with Lord Hensley, leaving her near one of the marble pillars where she might catch her breath. She accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing footman and tried to ignore the glances that slid in her direction. It was then that she heard the voice behind her, smooth and edged with malice. "I see the Viscount's new wife has finally dared to show her face," a lady said. "How courageous, considering the circumstances of her marriage." Quote. Another voice, sharper, added, "Some women will do anything to keep a title, even marry their husband's brother. Tragic, really." Amelia turned slowly. Two women stood a few paces away, richly dressed, their fans fluttering like wings of deceit. She recognized them vaguely from earlier seasons, Lady Vinton and Lady Fairley, both known for their venom masked as charm. Amelia met their gaze with quiet composure. "Good evening," she said. "I had not realized courage was so unfashionable a virtue." Lady Vinton's smile faltered. "I meant no offense, of course. One merely wonders how you manage the awkwardness of it all." "Awkwardness is often the burden of those who misunderstand," Amelia replied, her voice steady. "I have learned to bear it with grace." Lady Fairley opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice intervened. "Indeed," Edward said, appearing beside Amelia with a calm that barely concealed the edge beneath. "My wife bears many things with grace, including the impertinence of those who speak without thought." Both women turned, colour rising in their cheeks. "My lord, we were merely gossiping," he finished. "As idly as crows in winter. You will forgive me if I find it tedious." The surrounding guests had grown silent, eyes turning toward the confrontation. Edward's hand came to rest lightly at Amelia's waist, his tone measured but unmistakable. "The Viscount's wife deserves every ounce of respect my name carries. I trust that will be remembered." Lady Vinton stammered some apology and retreated, dragging her companion with her. The murmurs swelled again, softer now, uncertain. Edward turned to Amelia. "Are you all right?" She met his eyes. "Yes," she said quietly. "But you did not need to—" "I did," he interrupted. "I should have done so long ago." For a moment, neither moved. Then the orchestra struck up a new tune, and the noise of conversation resumed, as though nothing had happened. Yet the air between them had changed. "Shall we leave?" he asked. She nodded, her throat tight. In the carriage, silence returned, but it was not the same as before. It was filled with unspoken gratitude, with questions neither knew how to ask. The city lights passed in a blur of gold and shadow. At last, she said softly, "You surprised me tonight." He looked out the window. "I surprised myself." "Why?" "Because I realized how much I dislike hearing your name twisted by others." Amelia watched him, searching his face. "Then perhaps you are beginning to see me as something more than duty." His hers. Perhaps. The rest of the journey passed without words. When the carriage reached the hall, he helped her down, his touch lingering longer than courtesy required. Inside, the house was quiet, the fire in the entrance burning low. Amelia paused at the foot of the stairs. "Good night, Edward," she said. "Good night, Amelia." As she ascended, she felt his eyes upon her until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. He stood there a long while after, listening to the faint echo of her steps. That night, neither of them slept easily. In their separate rooms, they replayed the evening, the music, the words, the look that had passed between them like a spark in the dark. And when dawn came, both knew that something had shifted too far to be undone. The carriage wheels had barely cooled when Edward retreated to his study. The lamps were still burning, though the hour was well past midnight. He poured himself a glass of brandy but did not drink it, watching instead as the amber liquid caught the flicker of the fire. His reflection shimmered in the glass, uncertain, divided between pride and shame. The memory of the ballroom lingered, the flash of Amelia's face under the chandeliers, the cruel whispers, the sudden fury that had seized him when he heard her name spoken with contempt. He had not planned to speak as he did. The words had come unbidden, born of something deeper than decorum. Upstairs, Amelia removed her jewels one by one, setting them carefully upon the dressing table. The pins in her hair came loose, and the curls fell over her shoulders. The mirror reflected a face still pale from exhaustion, yet alive with a strange brightness she could not explain. Edward's voice echoed in her thoughts. "The Viscount's wife deserves every ounce of respect my name carries." The words should have sounded like duty, but they had not. They had sounded like conviction. She sat at the edge of the bed for a long while before deciding. The tension between them had grown too heavy to bear unspoken. Wrapping a shawl about her shoulders, she left her chamber and descended the stairs. The firelight from the study spilled faintly into the hall. Edward looked up when she entered. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something gentler. "You should be resting." "So should you," she replied. "I thought you might still be awake." He gestured to the chair opposite. "Will you sit?" She crossed the room, her gown whispering across the carpet, and took the offered seat. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence with its low hum. "I owe you thanks," she said finally, "for what you did tonight." "There is no need," he answered. "It was long overdue." "Still, I thank you. It is not often one is defended so publicly." He looked into the fire. "It was not gallantry. It was anger. I could not bear to see them look at you that way." Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it. "And why did it anger you?" He hesitated, fingers tightening around his glass. "Because I realized that I have been no better. I let myself believe what was convenient to believe." "What was convenient?" she asked. "That you married my brother for his title, that you stayed for comfort, that you cared for nothing but yourself." Amelia's eyes lowered. "And now? Now I know that I was wrong." The simple admission settled between them, like the first snowfall on bare ground, soft, almost soundless, yet transforming everything it touched. She folded her hands in her lap. "There are things you never knew," she said quietly. "About Henry, about me." He looked up. "Then tell me." Her gaze drifted to the flames. "Your brother was a kind man. Too kind, perhaps. When I married him, I believed he wanted a companion. I later learned he wanted a caretaker. His illness had begun before the wedding, though he hid it well. I did not realize until it was too late that he married me to protect me from my father's debts, from scandal, from ruin. He saved my reputation at the cost of his own happiness." Edward's brow furrowed. "And you? Did you ever love him?" "In a way," she said. "Not as he loved me, but with pity, with tenderness. I loved the man he tried to be despite his pain. When he grew weaker, I stayed because he needed someone to see him through the end. I promised him I would remain until his last breath." Her voice faltered. "That is why I could not leave after he died. I owed him that promise, and you mistook it for ambition." Edward's throat tightened. The truth struck with quiet force. All the resentment he had carried, all the accusations, seemed suddenly small, childish even. He set the glass aside, leaning forward. "I did not know," he said. "No," she replied. "You never asked." The words were not cruel. They were simply true. The fire popped, scattering small sparks across the hearth. Edward stared at them, his face lined with regret. "I thought I was protecting what remained of his honor," he said. "Instead, I have done nothing but dishonor you." Amelia rose slowly. "You were grieving. We both were. Perhaps neither of us knew how to be kind." He stood as well, uncertain whether to reach for her. "Amelia." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "You cannot undo the past, Edward, but you can choose what you do with what is left of it." Their eyes met and held. Something wordless passed between them, understanding perhaps, or the fragile beginning of forgiveness. For the first time, he saw her not as the ghost of his brother's life, but as a woman standing before him, real and human and heartbreakingly strong. "I do not deserve your patience," he said. "You do not need to," she answered. "You need only your honesty." He took a hesitant step closer. "Then you shall have it. I have been angry for so long that I forgot what it feels like to see clearly. Tonight I saw you as the others did, and I hated them for it. I think I hated myself even more." Her hand trembled where it rested against the chair. "And now?" "Now," he said softly, "I wish to begin again." Amelia's lips parted, but she found no words. The air between them was charged, too full for speech. After a moment, she inclined her head. "Then begin with this," she said. "Promise me that when you look at me, you will not see your brother's widow." He nodded slowly. "I promise." They stood there, the fire casting their shadows across the walls. The house, so often filled with silence, seemed to breathe again. At last she turned toward the door. "Good night, Edward," he answered almost in a whisper. "Good night, Amelia." When she was gone, he sank into his chair and pressed his hands to his face. He felt lighter than he had in years, and, at the same time, unbearably raw. The truth had unmoored him, stripped away the last remnants of certainty. But beneath the confusion was something new, a fragile, hopeful ache that refused to be ignored. In her chamber, Amelia stood before the window, watching the clouds drift across the moon. The ballroom, the whispers, the study all felt distant now, as though belonging to another life. For the first time since her marriage, she no longer felt invisible. Someone had finally seen her, and that simple act had changed everything. Downstairs, the fire burned low, its embers pulsing softly in the dark, as if echoing the rhythm of two hearts that had begun, at last, to beat in time. February crept into Ashbury Hall with grey skies and restless wind. The snow that had softened the world now melted into slush, seeping into the garden paths and dripping from the eaves in slow, mournful rhythm. Inside, the house was warm but strangely still. Amelia's illness returned without warning. What began as a cough after their late-night conversation grew into fever within days. Edward noticed first at breakfast. She arrived late, her complexion pale, a faint flush high on her cheeks. When he spoke, she smiled but did not answer at once, as if the effort of speech required more strength than she could spare. "You are unwell," he said. "It is only fatigue," she replied. "The air in this house is too heavy." He frowned. "You should rest. There is much to do. There is nothing more important than your health." She looked up then, surprised by the sharpness of his tone. "Very well," she said quietly, "if it eases your mind." But she did not rest. Later, when he returned from the estate office, he found her in the drawing-room by the fire, a shawl around her shoulders, the embroidery frame in her lap. Her fingers trembled with each stitch. "You should be in bed," he said. "I could not sleep." He crossed the room and crouched before her, taking the needle gently from her hand. "Then at least sit without trying to work yourself into collapse." A faint smile touched her lips. "You sound like Mrs. Wilkins." "Then she is a wise woman." Quote. He touched her forehead lightly. Her skin burned under his palm. "You have a fever." "It will pass," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. It did not pass. That night her cough worsened. By morning her body ached, and her breath came shallow and quick. The physician was sent for again. Edward paced the length of her chamber while the doctor examined her, his hands clenched behind his back. When the verdict came exhaustion and infection, the lungs inflamed, Edward felt a cold dread settle in his chest. "She must not be left alone," the doctor said. "Rest, warmth, quiet. It will be several days before we know whether the fever will break." Edward nodded, his jaw tight. "Do whatever is necessary." When they were alone, he took her hand. It felt small, fragile, as though the weight of his own fingers might bruise it. She stirred, half-conscious. "I told you it was nothing," she murmured. "You were wrong," he said softly. Her lips curved faintly. "I am often wrong, according to you." He tried to smile, but could not. "You are never wrong about what matters." Her eyes fluttered closed again, the lines of pain smoothing slightly as she drifted back into fevered sleep. Hours passed into a blur. Edward refused to leave her side. The servants brought him food that went untouched, tea that grew cold. He sat by the bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, counting each breath as though by sheer will he could keep it steady. At dusk, Mrs. Wilkins entered quietly. "My lord, you must rest. I will stay with her." He shook his head. "No. If she wakes, I will be here." The older woman hesitated, then nodded. "You care for her deeply." He did not look away from the bed. "Yes," he said. "Too late, perhaps, but yes." "Oh." When she left, the room fell into silence save for the crackle of the fire and Amelia's faint breathing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. "I thought I understood loss," he whispered, "but I was wrong about that too." The memory of his mother's death returned with brutal clarity, the helplessness, the guilt, the way his father had drowned himself in drink and debts. Edward had sworn he would never feel that weakness, that pain. Now it came for him anyway, fierce and merciless. He rose and moved to the window. Snow began to fall again, slow and soft. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. "Please," he murmured into the dark, unsure to whom he spoke. "Do not take her from me." When he turned back, she stirred restlessly. He crossed to the bed at once, taking her hand. Her eyes opened slightly, unfocused. "Edward," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "I am here." "You should not stay." "Car." "I will not leave." She tried to smile. "You make promises you cannot keep." "This one I will keep," he said firmly. "You must sleep now." Her lashes fluttered, and she drifted away again, leaving him with only the sound of her breathing and the weight of his own helplessness. The night deepened. Once, she called out, words broken by delirium. He leaned closer, catching fragments his name, and something that sounded like "want me too." The meaning struck him with the force of a confession. She had believed, even now, that his care was born only of duty. He bent his head beside her hand. "I want you, Amelia," he whispered, "more than I ever thought possible." He did not realize he had fallen asleep until dawn light touched the curtains. He woke with a start, disoriented, then saw her watching him. Her eyes were clearer now, her color faintly returned. Relief surged through him so powerfully he had to steady himself against the bedpost. "You frighten me," he said. "I frighten easily when I am weak," she replied, her voice hoarse but steady. "You are not weak," he said. "You have never been weak." Her smile trembled. "I must have been once, or I would not have married into a house that did not want me." He reached for her hand. "The house did not see what I see now." "And what do you see?" He looked at her for a long moment, searching for words that would not sound foolish. "Someone who makes the silence bearable." Her eyes filled with tears. "You should not say such things when I am ill. I might start to believe them." "Then believe them," he said quietly, "because they are true." The tears slipped down her cheeks, but she was smiling. He stayed beside her until the doctor returned. The fever had begun to break. Amelia slept peacefully for the first time in days, her hand resting lightly over his. When evening came, Edward went to the chapel. He had not set foot there since his brother's funeral. The air was cold and smelled faintly of damp stone. He knelt before the altar, his hands clasped tightly, and whispered words he had not spoken since boyhood. "If she lives," he said, "I will be better than I have been. I will not waste what I have been given. Let me keep her." The silence that followed was heavy but not empty. Somewhere beyond the walls the wind shifted, gentler now. He took it as an answer. When he returned to her room, Amelia was awake. She turned her head and smiled faintly at him. "You look as though you have made peace with something." "Perhaps I have," he said, "with myself, at least a little." He sat beside her, and she reached for his hand. "Do not look so grave, Edward. You have endured worse than a woman's fever, never one that mattered so much." Her lips curved, and she squeezed his fingers weakly. "You will recover from this affection soon enough." He shook his head. "No, Amelia, I think I am lost to it already." She closed her eyes, but her smile remained. For the first time, he did not hide what he felt. He sat there in the fading light, her hand warm in his, and understood that love, once awakened, could no longer be denied or disguised as duty. The days that followed passed in a quiet rhythm of recovery. The fever broke entirely by the third morning, leaving Amelia weak but conscious, her voice returning in small fragments. Edward, who had barely left her bedside, moved about the room with unusual care, drawing the curtains at dawn, tending the fire when its flames burned low. The servants had grown accustomed to his presence there. None dared remark upon it. When at last the doctor declared her out of danger, Edward felt the weight that had been pressing upon his chest lift. He thanked the man with genuine relief, though his voice trembled slightly. After the physician departed, he sat in the chair beside Amelia's bed, watching as she dozed in the pale afternoon light. Outside, rain streaked the window panes, but the soft sound no longer felt mournful. It was a lullaby, quiet and alive. Amelia stirred and opened her eyes. "You are still here," she whispered. "I told you I would not leave." Her lips curved faintly. "You are a man of your word, it seems." He leaned closer. "It frightened me seeing you like that. I have not known fear in years, not even at war. But last night I prayed." "You prayed?" she asked softly, surprised. "Yes. I am not sure to whom or for what, but I did. I suppose that counts for something." "It does," she said, her smile faint but real. "It means you have found faith again, even if it is only faith in hope." He was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, "I also found something else." Her brow furrowed slightly. "What is that?" He hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of the quilt. "The courage to admit what I have been too proud to speak." She looked at him, uncertain. "And what is it you wish to admit?" He rose, paced once toward the window, then turned back, unable to contain the restlessness that filled him. "I thought myself immune to affection. I believed that feeling nothing made me strong. When my brother died, I built walls around everything human in me. And then you came into this house quiet, patient, infuriatingly kind, and those walls began to crack. He drew a slow breath. When you collapsed, I thought I had lost you before I had even known you. I realized then that strength without love is not strength at all. It is emptiness. Amelia said nothing. Her eyes shone, but she did not interrupt. He came closer, stopping beside her bed. You have every reason to despise me, he said, for my cruelty, for my blindness. But I cannot let another day pass without saying what I should have said long ago. Her hand rested lightly on the blanket. He reached for it, his touch uncertain. Amelia, he said, and the sound of her name in his voice seemed almost reverent. I love you. She inhaled sharply, her gaze searching his face as if to measure the truth of his words. I do not expect forgiveness, he went on, nor any promise in return. But I need you to know that everything I am now, whatever better part of me remains, exists because of you. She turned her hand in his and laced her fingers through his, her grip weak but sure. You say this now, when the fever has barely left me. I say it because it is true, he said, and because I nearly lost the chance to say it at all. Her eyes filled with tears. I do not know if I can trust what I hear. You have worn your indifference so long. I fear it may return. Quote, Then I will prove it, he said simply. Every day if I must. He sank to one knee beside her, his head bowed, her hand still in his. You saved me, Amelia. I was barely alive when you entered this house. I see that now. You gave me reason to feel again. She lifted her free hand, touching his hair gently. I never meant to save you, Edward. I only wanted peace. Then let me give you that, he said. Let me try to make peace with you, with us. Cray. She looked down at him, her tears falling silently. I do not know how to begin again, she whispered. He rose, still holding her hand. We begin by leaving the past where it belongs. Her breath caught. And if I cannot forget, then we remember together, he said, and let remembering hurt less with time. She studied him for a long while. The firelight painted his features in soft gold, and she saw in them not the cold man she had married, but one laid bare by remorse and tenderness. At last she said, I do not know when it happened, but I think I began to love you the moment you stopped demanding to be right. He smiled then, a small, disbelieving smile. Then, I have been slower to learn than you. She squeezed his hand. Love is patient, Edward. It waits for us to catch up. He bent and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Then I will spend the rest of my life catching up. She laughed softly through her tears, the sound fragile but radiant. You make promises too easily. Only the ones I mean, he said. Outside, the rain stopped. A faint light broke through the clouds, pale but insistent. Edward noticed it first, then Amelia, who whispered, The storm has passed. Yes, he said, it has. He sat beside her once more, his arm resting on the chair, their hands still joined. For a long time they said nothing. The silence was no longer heavy. It was full, alive, a space that belonged entirely to them. When she finally drifted to sleep, he remained where he was, watching her breathing, the rise and fall of her chest. Each breath was a promise, each heartbeat a reminder of what he had almost lost. And when dawn came again, he whispered into the light, I will love you well, Amelia, for as long as I am allowed. Spring arrived quietly that year, carrying with it the scent of renewal. The heavy skies that had brooded over Ashbury Hall for so many months lifted, revealing blue so delicate it seemed almost shy. The gardens, long asleep beneath frost, stirred awake. Buds broke open on the hedges, and the great oaks that bordered the lawn began to unfurl their leaves in cautious green. Inside, the house reflected the season's changed sunlight, spilling through windows that had once seemed forever shuttered. Amelia walked slowly along the corridor, one hand resting on the curve of her belly. The physicians had confirmed her condition some weeks earlier, and the knowledge had transformed the air around them. Edward's joy, though quietly expressed, was unmistakable. His care for her had deepened into something steady and profound, a devotion that needed no words. He met her at the top of the stairs, his expression softening as soon as he saw her. You should not be on your feet so long, he said, offering his arm. I am hardly fragile, she replied, though her smile betrayed how much she liked his concern. Even so, he said, covering her hand with his. Indulge me. They descended together, unhurried, passing the portraits of ancestors whose solemn eyes no longer seemed quite so accusing. The house had taken on a different life. Laughter sometimes echoed down the halls, and the servants, once stiff and silent, now smiled when their mistress passed. Edward guided Amelia into the garden. The air was crisp and filled with birdsong. A small table had been set beneath the blossoming pear tree. Mrs. Wilkins had insisted that fresh air was good for both mother and child. Amelia sank onto the bench with a sigh of contentment. "It feels strange," she said, gazing at the world in bloom. "I have lived through so many seasons in this place, and yet only now does it truly seem alive." He sat beside her, his gaze following hers. "Because now it belongs to us, not to ghosts." She turned to him. "Do you still think of them, your brother, your parents?" "Of course," he said, "but not with anger anymore. I think of Henry with gratitude. Without him, I would never have known you. And of my parents with understanding. They did what they thought was necessary. We have both been learning to forgive the dead." Amelia reached for his hand. "And the living?" He smiled faintly. "That lesson, I hope, I have already learned." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Bees drifted lazily among the blossoms, and a breeze stirred the grass. The peace that surrounded them felt fragile yet certain, like the moment before a note fades but still vibrates in the air. Later that afternoon, Edward led her toward the far end of the garden, where the old oak cast a broad shadow across the lawn. Beneath it lay a small patch of earth newly turned. A single white lily grew there, bright against the dark soil. "For Henry," Amelia said softly. "For memory," Edward replied. "He would have wanted us to live." She bent slightly, resting her hand against the rough bark of the tree. "Do you think he would forgive us? For being happy?" "I think," Edward said, "that he would be relieved." A gust of wind carried petals through the air, scattering them across her gown. He brushed them gently from her shoulder, his hand lingering there. "You make this place seem like spring again," he said. She laughed quietly. "It was always capable of spring. You only needed to open the windows." He bent to kiss her forehead, his voice low. "Then may they never be closed again." Kamzeka. Evenings became their favorite hours. They often sat in the library, no longer separated by silence but surrounded by it in comfort. Amelia would read aloud while Edward worked through correspondence. Sometimes, when she grew tired, he would take the book from her hand and continue where she had left off, his voice unpracticed but tender. The servants whispered of the change in their master, the once severe man who now paused to greet them by name, who laughed when a child from the village ran across his path, who left his work to walk with his wife beneath the stars. To those who had known him before, it seemed nothing short of miraculous. When summer arrived, the hall filled with warmth and color. The nursery was prepared in quiet joy. Edward spent hours arranging the room, ensuring that sunlight would fall just so across the cradle. Amelia watched him, amusement mingling with affection. "You are more nervous than I am," she teased. "I have never felt such responsibility," he said, half in jest, half in truth. She reached for him, her hand covering his. "You will be a good father." He looked at her with an expression that held both wonder and humility. "If I am, it will be because I have learned from you." Quote. One afternoon, months later, they sat once more beneath the pear tree. The leaves had deepened into full summer green, and the air was heavy with the hum of bees. Amelia leaned back, resting against Edward's shoulder. The weight of the child within her moved faintly, a gentle reminder of the life they had made together. "Do you ever think," she asked, "of how different everything might have been if we had not been forced into this marriage?" He considered a moment. "Often, and yet I think fate is sometimes wiser than we are. We would never have chosen this path, but it led us where we needed to be." She smiled. "Then perhaps even sorrow can be kind in time." He nodded, his arm tightening around her. "It taught me that love is not born in comfort. It grows in the spaces where we choose to stay, even when it hurts." She turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing his collar. "You stayed. I nearly did not," he said quietly. "But you gave me reason. I'll tell you." The wind stirred again, carrying the scent of ripening fruit. Amelia closed her eyes and listened to the rhythm of his heartbeat against her ear. For the first time in years, the future no longer frightened her. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think the child will have your eyes." "And your stubbornness," he said. She laughed softly. "Then heaven help us both." He kissed the top of her head. "Heaven already has." Could. That evening, as dusk settled over the estate, they walked hand in hand through the garden. The lanterns glowed along the path, their light golden against the encroaching night. At the edge of the lawn, Amelia paused, looking toward the horizon where the last traces of sunlight lingered. "Do you remember," she said, "the night you told me you did not love me?" His grip on her hand tightened. "I remember too many things I wish I could change." "Do not change them," she said. "They brought us here." He turned to her then, his eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Amelia, I will spend every day proving what those words no longer mean. You already have," she whispered. Their lips met in the quiet between day and night, a kiss that was not born of apology, but of promise. Months later, when autumn came again, Ashbury Hall stood transformed. The laughter of an infant echoed down the corridors. The servants moved with lightness, the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and new beginnings. Edward often carried the child himself, pacing the halls with quiet awe, while Amelia watched from the doorway, her heart full. He would look up, smiling. "He has your calm," he would say. "And your eyes," she would answer. In those moments, the world felt complete. At night, when the house grew still, they would sit by the fire together, the baby sleeping between them, and Edward would say softly, "I once thought duty was the purpose of my life. Now I know it is love." And Amelia would reply, "Love is duty fulfilled willingly." He would take her hand, their fingers intertwining, and together they would watch the flames dance until they faded to embers. Years later, when visitors came to Ashbury Hall, they often spoke of the peace that seemed to dwell within its walls, the laughter that lingered in every corridor, the warmth that greeted them, even on the coldest days. Some called it fortune, others called it grace, but those who truly knew the story of the Viscount and his wife said it was something rarer still. It was redemption. And when the evening sun fell over the fields and the air smelled faintly of lilies and rain, Edward would sometimes take Amelia's hand, glance toward the hill where a single white lily still bloomed beneath the oak, and say quietly, he thought he married his brother's widow for duty, but she became his reason to live.